Winter, the word that once froze armies in their tracks. From Napoleon to Hitler, Russia's winters have always been weapons of their own. But this time, someone else decided to use that weapon. As the first cold wind swept across Eastern Europe, something unusual was happening on Ukraine's side of the front. There were no rushed offensives, no large troop movements, no grand announcements. Only silence, a calculated, waiting silence. Ukraine wasn't retreating. It was watching and waiting for the right moment to strike back in a way no one expected. For months, Russia had boasted that winter would do the fighting for them. They believed the cold would crush Ukraine's energy system, break the morale of its people, and freeze its soldiers in the trenches. Moscow called it General Frost, their oldest ally. But Kiev had learned from history. They knew that every winter, Russia's power grid becomes its own pressure point, stretched thin, overworked, and fragile. While Russian media bragged about stockpiles of gas and coal, Ukrainian intelligence quietly studied every pipeline, every refinery, every key facility that kept Russian cities warm. And there was one in particular, a sprawling complex near Bryansk, just 200 miles from the Ukrainian border. The Kondrashevsky chemical and gas plant. To most, it was just another industrial site. To Ukrainian strategists, it was the artery that pumped heating fuel to millions across Western Russia. Taking it down wouldn't just cause economic damage. It would strike directly at Russian confidence. A reminder that even far from the front, they were vulnerable. So Ukraine waited. While Russia's soldiers dug in for the winter, Ukrainian engineers and military planners worked in silence. Satellite data, flight paths, and missile ranges were analyzed down to the last meter. And most importantly, they waited for the perfect season. Because in warfare, timing isn't just about when to attack. It's about when the enemy needs something the most. By late October, the timing was perfect. Russia's heating season had officially begun. Gas reserves were low, demand was high, and every cubic meter of fuel mattered. That's when Ukraine's patience finally ended. Under the cover of night, deep inside an underground command post, the operation began. A single code phrase, transmitted through encrypted channels, activated one of Ukraine's most advanced long-range systems, the Storm Shadow, a British-made cruise missile designed for stealth, speed, and precision, capable of traveling hundreds of miles under radar coverage, hugging the Earth as it flies. Somewhere near the front line, Ukrainian technicians locked the missile's target coordinates. Bryansk, the gas plant. The Storm Shadow launched into the dark sky, invisible to Russian radar, flying low over fields, forests, and frozen rivers. Minutes later, an explosion tore through the still night air. Locals thought it was an earthquake. Others thought a meteor had fallen. But when the flames rose into the sky, there was no doubt something had struck a vital part of Russia's lifeline. In Kiev, the war rooms were silent. No celebration, no cheers, just quiet confirmation that the message had been delivered. Ukraine had waited for the winter and turned it into a weapon. The operation wasn't just about destruction. It was psychological. It said, "We can reach you anytime, anywhere." For Russia, the winter that was supposed to break Ukraine had just begun breaking them. The night of October 21st, 2025, was quiet in Bryansk, until it wasn't. Flames erupted across the Kondrashevsky chemical and gas plant, illuminating the dark horizon in shades of orange and red. Towers of smoke spiraled into the sky, twisting and blackening the frost-covered landscape. Locals thought the world was ending, but this was no accident. This was precision, cold, calculated, and deliberate. From Kiev, military analysts watched every detail unfold on satellite feeds. They didn't just track the fire, they tracked the chaos. The plant's furnaces, which processed critical heating fuel for Western Russia, were reduced to molten cores. Pipelines ruptured, storage tanks exploded, and a plume of toxic smoke flowed into the Desna River, shutting down a key logistics corridor. The attack was not random. Ukraine had spent months studying the plant, understanding its energy flow, production cycles, and vulnerabilities. They knew exactly when the furnaces were at peak operation, when the maximum number of storage tanks were full, and when the facility's defenses were weakest. And the tools used were equally sophisticated. The Storm Shadow cruise missile, capable of low-altitude, terrain-hugging flight, had crossed hundreds of miles, undetected by the S-400 Panzer S-1 systems. Its guidance wasn't just GPS. It relied on inertial navigation system, terrain-matching cameras, and preloaded satellite imagery. Even if the Russians jammed signals or scrambled radars, the missile could still find its mark with near-perfect precision. As the first missile impacted, its warhead tore through reinforced concrete, igniting storage tanks and turning the facility into a pressure cooker of molten steel and chemical fire. Within seconds, secondary explosions followed, a chain reaction amplifying the damage far beyond the initial strike. Russian command centers were caught off guard. By the time their radar detected the strike, it was too late. Multiple emergency response teams scrambled to the scene, but they were unprepared for the scale of destruction. Pipelines feeding nearby towns were severed, and key transport routes were blocked by fire and chemical contamination. For Ukraine, the strike had a dual purpose: tactical destruction and strategic disruption. The plant supplied nearly 40% of Russia's rocket propellant, not just heating fuel. The damage rippled across military operations, delaying artillery support, restricting fuel flow to missile units, and forcing Moscow to reroute air defense assets to protect what remained of Bryansk. And the psychological impact was just as devastating. Russian civilians watched the sky glow like an apocalypse. Social media filled with grainy videos, eyewitness accounts, and speculation. Authorities issued silence, claiming a technical malfunction, but the message was clear: no industrial site was untouchable. Analysts outside Russia immediately recognized the precision and planning involved. This wasn't a simple missile strike. It was a data-driven operation, executed with surgical timing. Ukrainian intelligence had used satellite thermal imagery, UAV reconnaissance, and cyber-coordinated data to ensure that every second, every angle, and every missile would hit critical points simultaneously. By morning, the scale of destruction was undeniable. 5 MLRS assembly lines were destroyed. Chemical contamination closed the Desna River transport corridor. Fuel shortages began affecting military supply chains. The impact on artillery and missile units was immediate. Thousands of rounds of propellant became unusable, and convoys were stranded, waiting for fuel that no longer existed. For Russia, the strike was more than a tactical loss. It was a blow to perception. Their billion-dollar air defense network, once considered invincible, had failed to stop a single well-planned missile. It shattered the illusion of control, forcing Kremlin strategists to reconsider frontline defense and production priorities. Strategically, the operation forced difficult decisions. Moscow had to pull S-400 batteries from the front lines to defend the remaining Bryansk facilities, creating blind spots and leaving troops exposed. Every defensive move to protect infrastructure came at the cost of operational readiness elsewhere. Ukraine had shown a key lesson of modern warfare. You don't need overwhelming force to disrupt a superpower. You need intelligence, timing, and precision. One missile, one carefully chosen target, and months of patient planning could create cascading effects far beyond the battlefield. As smoke settled over Bryansk and the first report of shortages began circulating, the message was unmistakable. The winter that was supposed to break Ukraine had been weaponized against Russia, and the ripple effects were only beginning. By dawn, the flames over Bryansk were still smoldering, but the real damage had already begun to spread, not just across the map, but through the nervous systems of Russia's military machine. What looked on the surface like a single, spectacular strike had set off a cascade of operational failures, logistical headaches, and a crisis of confidence that reached all the way to the Kremlin. First came the logistics shock. The Kondrashevsky complex did more than produce heating fuel. It was a linchpin in the supply chain for rocket propellant and other critical chemicals. With storage tanks vaporized and pipelines rent, whole batches of propellant were rendered useless or contaminated. Units in Kursk and Belgrade found fuel and propellant shipments delayed or simply not arriving. Convoys that had been timed with military precision stalled at checkpoints, while depots sat with stockpiles that could no longer be serviced. The immediate effect: artillery units reported shortages, launch schedules for cruise missiles slowed, and a key input for MLRS systems evaporated almost overnight. Those tactical shortages forced hard strategic choices in Moscow. Commanders were told to pick between two bad options: pull air defense assets back to shield remaining production hubs, or leave them forward to protect troops. The answer was a compromise that satisfied no one. S-400 batteries and Panzer systems were redeployed to the Bryansk region to plug the hole, each relocation opening up a 250-square-mile blind spot somewhere along the front. Ukrainian intelligence and strike units, always watching for gaps, adjusted quickly. Within days, Ukrainian reconnaissance reported increased success in deep raids and longer-range interdiction. Equipment losses ticked upward. Supply columns were ambushed with higher lethality, and the tempo of Russian operations slowed. But the fallout was not only material, it was psychological, and that proved to be the more corrosive effect. For years, Kremlin messaging had sold the image of a modern, impregnable Russian air defense umbrella. S-400s that could see for hundreds of miles, Panzer, S-1S that could neutralize swarms, electronic warfare suites that could blind satellites. Bryansk cracked that narrative. Videos and satellite thermal images circulating online made the abstract concrete. A factory that supplied 40% of rocket propellant laying in ruins, seen in real time by millions. Denials and technical malfunction statements from official channels were swallowed by a more persuasive medium: images and eyewitness accounts. Confidence in the defense architecture eroded within command circles. Officers who once assumed redundancy and invulnerability now had to factor in the real possibility of decisive, asymmetric attacks. Plans for offensives were delayed. Timelines slipped as commanders waited for resupplies that could not be guaranteed. Economically, the strike magnified friction across the system. Rail lines that carried feedstock were closed because of contamination threats. Insurance premiums for transport rose. Repair crews were overwhelmed. The Southern Railway, vital for moving heavy equipment and supplies, experienced cascading delays as hazardous material protocols were enacted. Each logistical friction point added hours and days to resupply cycles. And in war, hours and days can change the calculus of combat. Diplomatically, the strike also forced recalibration. Allies and neutral observers watched closely, a state that cannot protect its industrial heartland, even during its own heating season, projects vulnerability. Moscow faced pressure, both internally and externally, to respond in ways that would reassure domestic audiences without escalating into wider confrontation. That tightrope constrained options and bought Kiev time to consolidate gains. Perhaps the most consequential effect was strategic doctrine. Bryansk demonstrated that modern conflict is not just about tanks and airframes. It is about networks, data, sensors, satellites, supply chains. An operation that combines satellite-derived thermal analytics, UAV reconnaissance, low-cost FPV decoys, precision cruise missiles, and targeted electronic warfare exploited that network reality. It offered a template. Strike the nodes that hold the opponent's machine together, destroy capacity where it hurts the most, and force the enemy to react ineffectively. In the weeks after the strike, Moscow's attempts to plug the hole proved costly and imperfect. Emergency production runs were initiated, but rebuilding complex chemical plants is neither quick nor cheap. Replacement parts, safety certifications, and industrial expertise took time to marshal. Meanwhile, the front lines adjusted. Ukrainian forces exploited the temporary blind spots with targeted strikes and increased interdiction. Momentum, once a nebulous concept, began to favor the side willing to take asymmetric risks. In the end, the Bryansk operation was a case study in precision over mass and intelligence over brute force. It showed how a relatively small, well-executed strike can ripple through an adversary's logistics, doctrine, economy, and psychology, and force a powerful state to make impossible choices. It also reframed the tactical conversation. In the era of networks, every factory, rail line, and storage depot is a node, and nodes can be targeted to produce outsized strategic effects. So what should come next? Do you go after energy nodes, logistics hubs, or command and control centers? Each choice carries different risks and rewards. What is clear is this: Bryansk was not the end of a campaign. It was an inflection point. It proved that with patience, precision, and technological savvy, a smaller power can compel a larger one to change its behavior. Drop your analysis below. Which node would you target next, and why? If you want a deep dive into the weapons and systems used, the Storm Shadow, FPV swarms, ADM-160 style decoys, or Krasuka-like EW suites, tell us which to unpack next. Thanks for listening. If you found this breakdown useful, like, share, and subscribe for the next debrief, where we'll examine the tools, tactics, and tech that are reshaping modern warfare.